Yeah, Mark, and your talk at Music and Sky was very well received as well. It
Oh,
was
thank you.
yours and probably, well, Bear and Danny Katz were probably the three like the most talked about at Music and Sky this year. So props to you, man. People were really into it because you covered basically all the topics um, and that we cover on Music and Sky in a very concise way, hitting everything from consciousness to health, germ theory, shape of the world, the cosmos, and all that in a way that was quite profound in the way that you're able to just um, communicate these ideas in a very straightforward manner. So, and I appreciate that about you. And also, you do that in your books so well. So, welcome to the show, everyone. We're live. Give us a thumbs up. How do we sound? We're good. Check, check, 1, 2. Just checking my audio. Uh, great. We are good. I'm going to hit record, guys, and fire this up. Here we go. And boom, we're back for another episode of Alpha Cast. I'm Mike Winner, and I'm here as always with the very adroit Dr. Bear Paul Lando, coming to you live and direct from the
So
great.
are you referring to my physical adroitness or my mental adroitness?
Well, you're the full package, my friend.
Thank
Full
you.
package.
Thank you,
As
Michael.
I'm sure your college recruit said.
I
Uh,
always fondly anticipate your introductions for me every week.
well, I thought it was a good one because you're definitely not gullible. And the topic today, we're going to go down some rabbit holes here and maybe triggering some folks, but discernment is key. And definitely Berlando has been a guide for me in my life and developing my tools of discernment. So I'm very excited about today's topic, but yeah, good things happening here on the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns supreme. I was at the AV Gardens yesterday on the campus, the AV campus. We were shooting some
Campus.
Yep, we were shooting some media, and as you were saying before we went live with Mark here, we've got a team there finishing this pond finally, which will be awesome to get that installed and adding to the richness of the land there. What else is going on, Bear?
Well, we're excited about the pond. As you know, we've been digging it for this going on our second year now because it's pretty large, not just a pond. And in our last farm before we started developing this one, we had a great pond that was just rife with, wildlife. And of course, it attracted a lot of animals and everything. It's always just kind of fun to watch. But more than anything, we really enjoy aquaculture and using medicinals that actually grow in water. So that's going to open up a whole new vista for our growing operation here and allow us to have more of the products that are in our or ingredients that are in our products actually homegrown. So yeah, so we're excited about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I shot a little video I'm going to post today or tomorrow, just laying out the also in the lab, sort of the process that we're doing now for our new products, which is really Spagyric 2.0, if you will. It's the next level of where you're taking everything bare. So I'll post that, guys, on our YouTube and Telegram and on the private platform. Our private platform is an amazing place to join us to have insider conversations related to everything with Alpha Vedic and life and the nature of the cosmos, as we'll be diving in today with our buddy Mark Gober. So you can find out more about that at alphavedic.com/join-us. Without further ado, though, let's jump in here with Mark. Very excited to discuss one of our favorite topics and the nature of reality, really, is what this comes down to. And boy, with Mark's series, The End to Upside Down, is there a more fitting title for a series of countering the inversion of the mainstream conventional reality? Mark has been crushing it for many a year now, and we were discussing before we came live with him. We had the pleasure, I've had the pleasure now of hanging out with Mark in person twice, first in Nashville. Was that like a year and a half ago, Mark? And and then we had a lovely dinner with Alex Zek and his wife and some friends, had some great conversations. And then you came out to Music and Sky and absolutely crushed it there. It was kind of a late ad, and I'm so happy we're able to have you there and you're able to be officially part of the Music and Sky community now. And one thing I love about Music and Sky is it seems to always, when you do come and you engage with that community, you create lifelong friendships. And that's something that I'm very proud about with Alpha Vedic and Music and Sky, is the community we developed. And it's so great that you're a part of it, buddy. So we're quite honored to have you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I just want to commend both of you on your work over the years. I've learned so much from both of you. And thanks for all you're doing with Music and Sky as well. I mean, what an amazing event. I definitely recommend it to anyone listening. An amazing community of very open-minded people. And for those of us who are questioning the truth, it can sometimes feel isolating. And so it's amazing to have events like a Music and Sky and also Confluence, which Alex Zek and his colleagues have put together. And Mike, we hung out a little bit there just briefly too, which was fun.
That's right.
So yeah, it's great to be here, and I can't wait to chat about important topics, let's say.
Well, on that point, within academia, there's an insider saying about the three-tiered letters of achievement ladder in recognition of one's degree of intellectual prowess. It goes something like this. You have the BS, which equals bullshit. You have the MS, which is more shit. And you have the PhD, which is piled high and deep. A humorous rendition for sure, but unfortunately very spot on. That is Bear's great genius in comedy there. Many of us who suffered the hallowed halls of higher education soon after developed an acute buyer's remorse. Fortunately, the veils of deception grow thinner daily, revealing that all that we were taught was upside down. Our special guest for this episode, Mark Gober, is here to lend his perspective on whether we should just, quote unquote, trust the science. Mark is the author of An End to Upside Down Thinking in 2018, which won the IPPY Award for Best Science Book of the Year. He is also the author of An End to Upside Down Living, An End to Upside Down Liberty, An End to Upside Down Contact, The End to Upside Down Reset, The End to Upside Down Medicine, which is very close to our heart. And now I just released The End to Upside Down Cosmos, which was a phenomenal read, which we'll be covering today, along with touching on these other books that he's written. He's also the host of the podcast, Where Is My Mind? Mark serves on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Really cool. Was a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley and worked as an investment banker analyst with UBS in New York. He has been named one of IAM's Strategy 300, the world's leading intellectual property strategist. Gober graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University, where he wrote an award-winning thesis on Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning prospect theory, and was elected a captain of Princeton's Division I tennis team. So we have a fellow D1 athlete with us today, and a very bright fellow. Berlando, take it away.
Yeah, when I saw your bio, I was most impressed, not to diminish any of your other achievements, but most impressed because of kind of my leanings in your athletic ability and background. So, Mark, welcome. Really good to have you here. And this is going to be a real fun discussion. As Mike already alluded, this is right in our wheelhouse. And, when I was doing that write-up, of course, that kind of conveys my sentiments, not necessarily yours or anybody else. And it was, well, to be generous about my educational experience, I would say what I really got out of it was a vocabulary. And that vocabulary allowed me later on in my clinical experience, farming experience, and other things that I've been involved with, to be able to translate my experience in a vocabulary that normie world would think is legitimate. So we run into this all the time, where everything we've been taught, including our vocabulary, is kind of upside down. And Mike and I were actually in a conversation about this yesterday, and that we're talking about certain subject matter, but then necessarily having to use the common vernacular. And even though those words really have different connotations to us compared to how they're usually used in the public there. So, but really great to have you here. And, what we're really going to discuss here, I guess, today is more the nature of our realm. And I've always been a globe skeptic, we'll say. I have no idea what shape, the realm is that we live in. My um, take is usually from old text from centuries past, where they really revealed the mechanics of the realm, which has an etheric creative mechanism. And so, where I come from, it's a technological, functional realm. And when I learned those principles and applied them to clinical medicine, farming, and so forth, things seemed to work really well. And it was a cohesive, not complex of theories trying to explain things, but a real continuity of an understanding of the way things work. And the closer you get to the truth, it actually gets more and more simple, which leads me back to my education, trigonometry, calculus, or physics and all the stuff that I had to endure. It's like, well, okay, but really not that relevant when you get out in the real world. So, Mark, welcome. And why don't you just maybe highlight some of your background that got you to this place? And you come from a very prestigious institution. You did very well. You excelled in that. And but now all of a sudden you're a bit of a renegade. So what happened?
Well, Bear, thank you for that introduction. What happened? Well, I think as I was going through my even, let's say, high school years and before, I had this focus on achievement, and we could get really metaphysical and deep as to why that was the case. But in any event, I just wanted to win. So if there was a challenge in front of me, I had to achieve it, and the failure was not an option. So that was a very stressful way to live life. And I didn't have any metaphysical sense of meaning or purpose behind it. And as I became more and more, quote unquote, educated, or as I, let's say, learned more within the system, the more I came to believe that we live in a random and meaningless universe. And that when we die, that's the end of our consciousness. It's lights out. There's certainly nothing spiritual or religious that's part of our reality. And that led me to a very nihilistic worldview. So one can imagine what that would be like to continue to go through these very high pressure situations, whether it was in athletics or in academia, or then in the world of investment banking. I graduated in 2008. So when I was working in New York, it was during the financial crisis. Not a healthy time in any way, mentally or physically for me to be there. But I left New York and joined a firm first in Boston, but the majority of the time was in Silicon Valley, advising technology-focused companies. And as I went through that, I had the same sense of nihilism. So as the challenges in life piled up, whether personally or professionally, it became more and more difficult to manage them. And so I hit a wall. Really, I could trace it maybe to 2014, but really in 2016 was the epi crisis, so to speak, where I felt like I was a zombie. And I wasn't looking for a new solution. I just thought, well, this is the way life is, and I'm going to have to deal with it. I started listening to podcasts that year. Initially, it was Tim Ferriss, so a little bit alternative, but still within the mainstream. I was listening to venture capitalists talk, and I said, this is so cool. You can hear really smart people talk for hours, because podcasts were a bit newer at the time. Now everyone listened to podcasts. Back then, it was a little more on the fringe, but still becoming more mainstream. And I was listening to ideas about alternative health. So Tim Ferriss was talking a lot about psychedelics, and I wasn't feeling called to that, but he talked about other things you could do, like sensory deprivation tanks and other ways of working with the mind. So I was exploring that, exploring alternative health, was listening to other shows. And long story short, I started to come across ideas about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness. Were my assumptions wrong about who and what we are? And that led me to just want to explore nonstop. So when I wasn't working in 2016, all I was doing was reading books, scientific papers, listening to podcasts. And very quickly, I realized that my old paradigm was wrong. I didn't know exactly what was true, but there was much more to reality than meets the eyes. So I became obsessed, basically, where I couldn't focus on anything else. And I couldn't even talk to many people about it, because I didn't realize there was such a big community of those who were questioning reality. And I decided about a year later in 2017, I should put these ideas that I've been researching just in the way that I do professionally, because I was doing similar work where I had to take a lot of complex topics, especially in the realm of technology and patented technologies. I had to summarize that for boards of directors and senior management teams who had a very short attention span and have all the citations there. I said, why don't I apply that same thing that I've been doing for years to this topic that I think is even more important? So that was my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. And there were a lot of synchronicities along the way. I mean, I was able to, I reached out to a literary agent who responded to me the same day. And that's just, I don't know what happened, but he read my email, Bill Gladstone, and he read my book and he said, love it, love the book, but this is the title. The title is An End to Upside Down Thinking. So I didn't even come up with it, nor did I know that there would be other things that thought would be upside down. So it's interesting that my publisher, who recently passed away, sadly, Bill Gladstone of Waterside Productions, he had the foresight to know that I would write more. He always talked about future books, and I said, well, I don't know about that. But that there were many other paradigms that I would challenge. So long story short, I left my job right before COVID and then have written a number of other books that have challenged the political system, medicine, cosmology, everything I seem to look at where I ask, what are the assumptions about why we're told the things we're told? And why do I believe those things? When I look at the fundamental aspects of those assumptions, I realize, wow, there are a lot of flaws here. And then it's a rabbit hole.
I think we really need to give the initial credit for the upside down concept to Dr. Seuss. I said, what was the book we read as a child? It was Inside Out, Upside Down. But anyway, not taking anything away from anybody else. So
I will say that though, Bear, you're
Yeah.
right on, because as kids, all reading that, he showed one, the power of imagination, but two, how ridiculous the idea of material reality is, right? Because in all those books, essentially, material reality breaks down into the fantastic and the imagination, which was what central
I
theme
think
of
the
Mark.
good I think the good doctor might have been imbibing something back then, because if you look at some of his artwork, not in the books, but have you ever seen his actual, paintings and things? The guy was tripping on something. So anyway, sorry for the diversion there. But so tell us, why don't we just jump right into this realm? Because that, people that call themselves flat earthers, of course, they believe that it's the most important subject of our time to expose the real truth and all the rabbit holes and agendas and so forth. But why don't we go into why you started questioning the actual nature of our realm? You've kind of alluded to it already, but and maybe with that segue into, well, what do you think it is?
This was not a topic that I was exploring explicitly from the beginning. I was exploring the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, but I never thought until more recently to ask, where do we live? I was typically asking, who are we and why are we here? But I didn't ask what here is. I had this model of cosmology, of the Big Bang and of an expanding universe, and we're a little speck revolving around the sun. And as I started to research topics over the years, inevitably this notion of shape of Earth comes up. So I did hear some people talk about it over the years. And I didn't really explore it in any depth until earlier this year. I went to Confluence. As I mentioned, this was in Texas in April of 2024, and the topic was coming up everywhere. And the book I wrote before this was An End to Upside Down Medicine, where I explore challenges to germ theory, which I also similarly in the past had heard people talk about, but hadn't dug into it until 2023. And Mike and I were in Rebels for a Cause in Tennessee, and Alex Zeck gave a talk there, and we were talking about this stuff, and I didn't really know much about it. And at first I thought, well, this is such a huge paradigm shift. Could it be true? And when I looked into it and I watched the End of COVID series, which I recommend to your audience at theendofcovid.com, which I was a participant in that, talking about politics and the Great Reset, not about medicine. But as I explored the paradigm shift and the logical fallacies, I said, wow, I've got to write a book about this. Many of the people who challenge germ theory, I found, excuse me, are also challenging cosmology. So to me, that was an immediate red flag of, wait a second. I know how these people think. They're very logical, and they came to the same conclusions that I did, or I was able to follow their logic, and I agreed with them. And they're saying, Mark, you've got to look at cosmology. There was a lot of that. People who had looked at one paradigm saying it's a similar thing in cosmology. So I said, all right, I'll look at this. And it was very challenging for me at first to say, like, I don't even know where I stand, because it's so disorienting to think maybe the notion of where I live is not what I've been told. Are we moving? Are we in an expanding universe at over 1 million miles an hour? Or is Earth actually stationary as it feels? When we look up in the sky, it looks like things are moving around us, sun, moon, celestial bodies, but we're told that we're in motion. And like, should we trust our senses or should we not? I started to ask those questions and looked at the arguments. And I came to a very similar place to where I came with germ theory, where I said, this is such an important topic that it's worth exposing what the arguments are. Without necessarily knowing for sure what the truth is, there are clearly holes in the consensus cosmology, and the topic is rife with many misconceptions. So when you ask people about this, often they don't even know what the arguments are or what people are saying. They might say, oh, well, you're just a flat earther. You believe in a disk floating in space revolving around the sun where you fall off the edge. And I don't even know anyone who believes that, for example. Or some people will say, well, there's this disk that's floating upward 9.8 meters per second squared because of gravity, because the Flat Earth Society says that's true. If you look at people who are questioning cosmology, they don't say that. So there are psyops on psyops here. And I'm not saying I know exactly what the truth is, but what I wanted to do is try to present a cohesive argument of what people are saying, what the history of it is. And where I come out bare is I don't think the consensus cosmology is true, and we could talk about the reasons why. I think there are observations that clearly challenge the spherical globe model. But like you said before, I can't actually tell you what is true. And before I pause, I'm going to tell you why. And
Mm-hmm.
and also I want to pause by saying before I go into this that I am, like I do in many of my books, is summarizing what many other people have said for a long time. Okay, so there are many others out there. You've interviewed Austin Whitsitt, Dave Weiss has been talking about this, but even back in the 1800s, Robotham was writing about this. Many other people throughout history, and I'm trying to summarize these arguments. So that's the preface. But why is it impossible currently for us to have a comprehensive model for where we live? Number one, we would need to be able to dig all the way down, especially if we're trying to prove a globe, because the globe model says there's a radius value of roughly 4,000 miles. So we'd have to dig 4,000 miles down to the core and then 4,000 miles more down to the other side of Earth and through space. How far have we been able to dig down? Under 8 miles so far. That's the farthest we've been able to go in any exploration. So that's one big problem. We haven't been able to go down very far. Also, we'd want to be able to go up very high and do that independently and not just rely on space agencies or a few independent, like Elon Musk and others that are exploring. And we'd want to go really, really far out. So ideally, it would be great, especially if we were trying to prove the globe, to have continuous video footage of the sphere doing a full rotation where you could see everything on Earth. You'd see the buildings standing upright on top, upside down on the bottom, hanging sideways on the side, and you could see every point on Earth. We don't have that. We'd also like to be able to see Earth within the solar system, within the context of the sun and the other planets, as we're told in the mainstream cosmology that Earth is a certain distance away from the sun. We'd want to have footage of that to see all these things happening. We don't have that. So that's a problem. But then even within Earth itself, we're restricted in terms of what we can explore. There are restrictions in terms of exploring the North Pole, which I talk about in the book, but especially the South Pole. Since the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, there have been restrictions in terms of exploring freely and privately below the 60th south latitude. That's a big problem because the mainstream cosmology and mainstream view of Earth says that Antarctica is an island in the ocean, basically. And yet there is another belief out there that we live basically within a circle, so Earth is round in that sense. But if you took everything on the globe, put it into a circular lake, and had an ice wall around the side, that's another alternative model that's out there. And the ice wall is Antarctica. So if we wanted to try to validate or invalidate that, we would need to be able to freely and privately explore Antarctica, which we can't do. So we run into problems in terms of coming up with an alternative cosmology definitively. But what we can do, just like what we can do with germ theory, is show very clear flaws as to what's happening. So, for example, we might be able to disprove one reason as to why people get sick, but we might not know exactly all the reasons why someone does get sick. We could try to, but it's not sufficient to have a comprehensive alternative when we're trying to disprove a current model. There are two independent exercises. One is this model wrong? Another is, what's the right model? And before I pause, I'm just going to give one example here because this I was trying to explain to people this idea. And what I came up with is, imagine we're taking a multiple choice test, the three of us together. And the teacher says, you have to collectively present me the answer. And the answer is either A, B, C, or D. And you guys come to me and say, Mark, we think it's A. And I say, well, I've spent the last week on this too, and I can show you these reasons why A has been falsified definitively. And you say, okay, Mark, those are some good arguments, but so tell me, is it B, C, or D? And I say, well, I don't know. I haven't been able to explore that yet. And then you say to me, okay, well, then it must be A. It must be A because you can't tell me what the answer is. That's not hopefully the nature of this conversation we'll have. That's not what I'm going for in my books. What I'm saying is we can show that A is wrong. I can't tell you yet if it's B, C, or D for sure, but A, it ain't it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's pretend we have no dog in any fight here. And we were all brought up in classical education, and we have, we've been trained in logical thinking and debate. And if you didn't know anything and you were just sitting back and listening to the discourse out there between the two opposing sides, you'd quickly see that the conventional science world always resorts to logical fallacies and theoretical concepts in order to justify their positions. And of course, the greatest logical fallacy that they fall, uh, back on all the time is ad hominem attacks. You're a flat earther, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're an anti-vaxxer. It's always got to be a pejorative, but there's never a follow-up as far as, well, okay, I can accept that, but why is that true? And we never go there. So it really doesn't require a superior intellect just to see right through that. The veils are pretty thin as far as their arguments. So my question is, how do we have these educational systems that rely on these things and incongruous theories and extrapolations that are, very far reaching, and so-called intelligent, educated people, especially doctors, let's just use them as an example. How is it that we can fall prey to such easily discernible things?
Well, I think one aspect is ego, where some
Mhm.
people have been spending a whole career on an idea and promoting an idea. It's very hard to say I was wrong. My whole career has been a lie, or I've been succumbing to logical fallacies. And then if you multiply that by all of the academics out there and the power that they have and their ability to transmit information, we could see how there's a bias. But also, I'm just remembering some of the conversations I've had with doctors after my book on medicine came out. And I would ask a very basic question: how do you know that a virus exists and causes disease? Which Dr. Tom Cowan has asked, and many others have been talking about this. And I would get answers like, well, I saw a PCR test and that told me, or a lot of people got sick in the same place and they must have caught something. And these are, of course, not uh, the best explanations. And then I would say, well, are you familiar with the 1954 Enders and People study, which was the initial quote unquote isolation study, even though they're not isolating using the traditional definition of the term. Most of them were not familiar with that. And then I would ask, well, how do you know that these are transmissible agents? Allegedly, that a microbe can go from one person to another and cause disease. And they would say, well, hadn't that been established long ago where they ran these contagion studies? And I'd say, well, how did they run the contagion studies? And they often were not aware of the methodologies of injecting things into animals, injecting them into their brains and tracheas and things like that, which are unpurified samples and not using controls. And they were unaware of these studies, or the Rosenau studies with the Spanish flu, where they tried to transmit by having people cough in each other's faces and otherwise, and they weren't able to do so. My point is, there's a whole history that many experts, so-called experts and professionals and people with degrees, they're not aware of that. And in the medical field, I can understand it because there's so much pressure just to get into med school. It's so hard. And then when you're in med school, you're trying to get residency and fellowship. And do you really have time to ask questions about the assumptions in your textbooks? I get it totally. So you end up with people who have these credentials and you just assume that they've looked at all the assumptions that underlie their beliefs. And often they've never done so. And I think the same thing applies to cosmology. It applies to other areas too. I saw it with consciousness, even the field of economics. In the Austrian School of Economics is something I've come across and write about, for example. But I'll give one example, Bear, that comes to mind from my book. The notion of dark matter, something I actually wrote about in my first book. I said, because I was talking about the nature of reality. And look, scientists tell us that 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. We only know what 4% is. That means there's so much we don't understand. But what I wasn't looking at back then, well, why do we have dark matter in the first place? And it comes from an observation by Fritz Zwicky, an astronomer in 1933. He was observing the Coma cluster of galaxies. And basically, the observations that he was seeing didn't match Einstein's general relativity or gravity, generally speaking. So basically, there was a lot of missing mass there. What the laws of physics told us said that there was under 1% of the stuff that should have been there, and it wasn't there. So they said, well, there must be dark matter. They discovered dark matter. The alternative, obviously, is, well, maybe there isn't any dark matter, and maybe we need to rethink Einstein's relativity and Newton's gravity, and that's not what mainstream physics does. So then I quote a physicist named Pavel Krupa from the University of Bonn in Germany, mainstream astrophysicist. He says, look, my colleagues and I have spent 25 years on this looking at dark matter. We have falsified it with more than 5 sigma confidence, meaning more than 99% confidence. It's not there. And the interviewer says to Pavel Krupa, then, why are people studying dark matter? if it's not there and you've clearly falsified it? And he said, it's likely due to sociological pressures. That in academia, you win prizes if you're studying dark matter. This is the hot thing to do if you're an academic. So you end up getting steered in a very strange way away from the truth, but towards what's popular and what the in thing to do is. And I think that's a very powerful idea that we probably see throughout science and throughout all areas of inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think the one level of science that they've really mastered is the science of ridicule. And when you go into the general population, the last thing people want to be aligned with is a concept that's controversial, that you don't believe in germ theory and or maybe question the nature of the realm, because immediately you're delegated to just, quackery. And I suffered that greatly during my years of practice. And, I really believe that practical experience and empirical observation is, were the foundations of what we consider science from the get-go, but we don't do that anymore. And all I used to do in practice is, I learned different things, I applied them, and they seemed to work brilliantly. And then in the meantime, my colleagues in the conventional side of the fence would employ their techniques and they'd fail miserably. So somewhere you just have to sit back and say, maybe there's something to this. But again, it's just like, well, don't believe him. He's a quack. And so here we are. And in the general public, you definitely, especially with the MK Ultra indoctrination of the population at this stage, where everybody, doesn't want to be called these pejoratives, you fall in line. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying about professionals having the same issue.
Can we also say one thing, Mark, too? I'm curious if this is an angle, because Bear and I talk about the practicalities and the effects of such thinking, especially in conventional scientific circles. And what I found is most of those guys and women are suffering in some physical malady. They tend to, most of them have gotten the jibby jab. And I think that's a direct example and a result of that. Maybe it's mass denial syndrome of what the reality is. But then you look at quote unquote flat earthers or people like us who are more around idealism and simulation and stuff, and see the fun of the magical realm. And we tend to not get hoodwinked by the conventional control systems. We tend to be healthy and happy and tan and smiley and all that. And you think of like Einstein. How did Einstein die? He died from a brain aneurysm. So, we're talking about maybe somebody whose brain imploded because of the lies that he knew it was telling himself, right? So this touches into Germanic New Medicine and stuff, but that's an interesting angle, right? To see literally, because we talk about what's the function in the end. And one of the main ways that we can see how things function is through our own body and our own health. Who tends to be healthier? Those who are questioning and are radicals and are, actually living from their own sensory inputs and belief systems, or those who are following the conventional lines of thought?
It's a great point. And who's falling for psyops more or less? You bring up a point, Mike, that actually has come to me more since the book has been published. So when I was at Confluence in Texas, Alex Zex and colleagues events, I had a conversation with Yerasimos from Here for the Truth podcast and Melly Newbeck the last day of the conference. And they were saying, look, everyone here's, debating the shape of the earth. There's so many people talking about it. Why does it really matter? And at the time I hadn't looked much into it. And I said, yeah, I don't really understand it. They're, they say in my day-to-day, this isn't affecting me practically. I still have to go and do my stuff. And there are other topics that seem more important. So when I was researching this topic and saw that clearly that the current cosmology is incorrect, people say, well, why is there a lie? And some argue that resources are being hidden. If we have an incorrect map, there might be resources that could bring more prosperity to everyone, for example. Or if the physics is being hidden, then maybe there's free energy that could bring more to the world and bring back the ether, for example. That could help everyone. And maybe it's, if we believe that we're just a small, insignificant speck and a little blue dot in a massive expanding universe, then we feel like we're insignificant, and that takes God out of the picture, for example, or an intelligent creator. Those are theories that I've heard. But I'm actually leaning even more to what you were saying, Mike, which is that if we are living out of resonance with the truth, with something so fundamental as where we live, in addition to who and what we are, but also where we are. And if we're told to basically abandon our senses and just trust, oh, there must be this dark matter thing here that we can't prove to you, but it makes up the majority of the universe with dark energy. And we have to continue to trust things that actually violate our common sense. What does that do to our health and to our ordinary being? Perhaps it creates a sense of dis-ease because we're living in a falsehood. So I think that whether it's the cosmology topic or anything, I think a priority for a human being should be to remove falsehoods, because those falsehoods probably weigh us down in ways that we can't even fully appreciate or sometimes even quantify.
Yeah, I think the most important axiom that the old scholars had was know yourself and you shall know the universe, you'll know yourself. And I think that's the biggest secret is they don't want us to understand how we work because then we wouldn't be victimized anymore by any predator class.
And I'll just add, I think they're serving lots of masters. So I think it's all of those things. It's many, like we've been talking about the recent storms that have been generated, which have been insane. And actually mad props and shout out to our community who were praying and doing meditation and decrees. It seems like the storm, the Milton didn't hit as hard as they were trying to project into the matrix. So awesome. And our hearts go out to everybody who's been affected by that. But that being said, there's lots of masters being served here, right? But yeah, beautifully said though, Mark, for sure.
Yeah, there's something also about offloading authority to third parties that we see in medicine and other things where we're just supposed to trust an authority, even if what they tell us doesn't make sense to us. They tell us it's true and therefore it is true. And if we can break free of that, then we become less susceptible to everything that's being imposed on us. And perhaps that general theme is what will get us into a freer world. If we can begin to take more responsibility for our thoughts and our beliefs and our health, then we will be less susceptible to everything that's being thrown at us.
Yeah, and more responsibility means accountability, and that's the big thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So interesting. What I liked about your book here is you really kind of take everything chapter by chapter in a very easy way to follow. And guys, I highly recommend all of Mark's books because they're an easy read for what can often be considered dense material. And they're very well constructed and in a way that's entertaining to read and very well cited. There's tons of citation at the end. So this is an academic, really an academic achievement. This isn't just some hokey conspiracy book, right? And we need more of this in our community. So thank you, Mark. But
yeah, it's so important that we have intellects like yourself, Mark, that can delineate in the conventional, language so that people can, well, it gives it street cred. People like yourself, Andy Kaufman, that did it in the last couple years. Otherwise we're just relying on, people like myself that are just doing things, but that doesn't really get the same street cred as folks that can go in, use the higher education, the vernacular and so forth in order to make a case in their own terms. So yeah, invaluable work that you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. And one of the challenges that I face, and I'm going to say this because I have a feeling many members of your audience face this in their own lives, maybe not in the way that we're doing it on a public podcast, but I have to check myself before I put something out or talk about it publicly or even speak about it with other people, because there is a sense of responsibility that I don't want to mislead people. I don't want to mislead myself. So when I write the books, I try to be careful about how far I go with my claims, and everything is cited so you can see where the logic is. And if the logic has a flaw in it, then we can find out where the mistake was or if there was an assumption that was incorrect. But as I do this publicly, my personal evolutionary journey I've been public since 2018, I have to realize where I've been wrong in the past. So in my first book, for example, I very casually mentioned germ theory and shape of the earth, for example, as things where we had transcended old belief systems. And I hadn't even thought that those were assumptions that I was holding that might be untrue. And my second book, for example, has a picture of a globe on the cover. And it wasn't about the globe, but it's just these things that I had assumed to be true and hadn't even thought about. So I have to also be willing to accept where I was wrong and then think about what I'm doing now and say, well, maybe is there something that I'm going to disagree with in the future that I believe to be true now? So what I I'm less these days about belief than I am about just saying I have things that I think are true with varying degrees of probability.
Yeah, and that holds true into, for instance, practical clinical practice as well, or farming. There are things that I did decades ago that I wouldn't agree with at all now, but the reason why I changed my mind is because, you do things, it gives you a certain experience, and it may turn out to be not what you anticipated or desired in the first place. So you change what you do. You learn different things. And bottom line, when it comes to medicine or farming, my whole philosophy is it either grows corn or not. And if it doesn't, then you have to change your mind and change what you do. And that's how we evolved the species, I believe.
Yeah, the practical elements you're describing are so
Mhm.
important. And it's very important when we get into these topics that can be very heady and abstract, bringing it back to the practical. And maybe the biggest practical is where Mike was going before, that life ends up getting better, I found, for those who explore these
Mhm.
topics deeply and embody them. Many of the old, I don't know what you want to call it, weight, because I felt this myself, that I'm still shedding, by the way. I don't claim to be there. But there was a heaviness I had before where I felt like I was a zombie and I was living in this world of just being on a treadmill and trying to achieve the next thing, but not feel like I was getting anywhere and not even seeing a future, to having a much more expanded view where I feel much happier and much with a greater sense of purpose. I'm not perfect. It's a jagged upward trajectory. I sometimes compare it to a stock price chart. If you look at the S&P over time, it has an upward trajectory, but you see a lot of dips along the way. That's what it can sometimes feel like. But the proof is in the pudding for those who really can liberate themselves from old belief systems, often ones that were false, that we end up living better lives. And then I also think more creativity seems to come in, which can lead to practical solutions.
Yeah. So interesting thing that's going to be going down, I've heard, and maybe you've heard about this, Mark, and you touch on it in your book, is that folks believe that they have the definitive proof now of whether the flat cosmology model, at least the map that like David Weiss has put out, the with the ice wall, that theory, because there's lots of other maps out there, and we've entertained those like FPV Angel, and there's different ones that relate to different cosmologies that aren't globe. But that being said, there is a expedition supposedly, and this has been brought up in our Telegram group recently, of folks going down to Antarctica to actually see and the truth around whether it's going to be light for 24 hours or not, or they're going to be able to, excuse me, very important distinction. They're going to be able to see the sun for the full 24 hours during the winter, right? Is that right? This upcoming winter, because if it's a globe shape, then the way that the tilt of the axis works is that you have 24-hour winters in Antarctica, where on the ring wall map, that's impossible because of how the localized sun works. Now, you bring up a very important element to this, but I guess, and I would love for you to touch on that, the idea of light, right, and the
Mhm.
refraction off the dome or whatever. But that being said, I believe Austin Whitsitt and Jaron are going to go. I've heard some others have declined to go, and I'm not sure who's on the other side. And once again, Bear and I don't get into this dialectic between the shape. Like, we stay out of that because we see that as actually sort of that controversy is actually getting us out of the proper, you know, real reality of our own idealistic creation from our consciousness. But that being said, have you heard about this? And I'd love to touch on what you talk about and the difference between light and sun, in terms of that topic.
Yeah, so I've followed it loosely. I know people are talking about an expedition, and let me just explain, as I understand it, why this is such an important thing to many people. That if, well, first of all, the reason people want to go is that there is a lack of credible footage. That's the claim of the sun in Antarctica. And ideally, people would want to see continuous 24-hour footage. And they claim that the government footage that there is cuts out for a few hours every day, and that there might be some other footage that's been there, but there are anomalies, so they don't believe it. So they say, look, we need to go there, have globe skeptics, globe believers, get everyone there and see what's going on with the sun. And the idea is that if you can observe the sun, the actual sun itself in the sky for 24 hours, that would not be possible on the conventional flat Earth model, versus if you did have 24-hour sunlight where the sun is invisible for that entire time, you could have that on the conventional flat Earth model because of a phenomenon in physics known as coffee cup caustic, where basically if you shine a light on something that has a dome around it, which is part of the flat Earth model, that there's a firmament that's discussed in the Bible and elsewhere. They talk about the waters above and the waters below. But if you shine a light, it goes around the perimeter. So you could have a sun on the other side of a circular flat Earth, even though you can't see it on one side of Antarctica. The light would somehow, because of coffee cup caustic, you'd be able to see it on the other side. So that's what I believe they want to explore. My opinion on it is that because this is such a controversial idea, we're going to need a lot of independent verification, probably many expeditions of people with 24-hour footage. And then you run into problems with the atmosphere, and can you actually see the sun when there are clouds? I don't know how they're going to do this, and I haven't looked into it myself. And then I ask even deeper questions, because there are traditions that believe, for example, that there's a black sun. And that, Crow 777 did a documentary series where he shows what he believes, or what many believe, is a lunar wave. He looks at his telescope and you can see it looks like water basically is the medium that the moon's in. That's what it looks like, at least visually. But at the end of that documentary, he shows he's looking at the sun with his telescope and looks at another thing that looks like another sun. That's very difficult to explain, and he did a bunch of things. I don't know the technicalities of it, but he tried to remove the anomalies that might be there, and he thinks, well, maybe there's another light that we don't understand. So I just throw that in the mix, because maybe there are elements of our reality that could confound this debate of one or the other that isn't being considered as much.
I think the primary question that's missing in the conventional dialogue is, what is consciousness?
Yeah.
And of course, we're trying to find consciousness in matter. We're trying to find consciousness in the physical brain. So maybe if we go there a little bit, we can get into more of the actual creative mechanics of how things emanate from consciousness in the first place. And is that in fact true or not?
Yeah, Bear, I agree with you. That to me is the fundamentals of all this. And it's interestingly where I started my journey. The subtitle of my first book, An End Upside Down Thinking, is Dispelling the Myth That the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. Because consciousness is what we all need in order to be able to ask these questions. And from our own experience, everything is actually consciousness. What we call physical matter is an experience that we register within our consciousness in the present moment, always. We look at something and then we do a whole bunch of mental gymnastics to say that this is physical. We touch it, we do mental gymnastics to say this is physical. But based on our experience, it is literally just a modulation, as Rupert Spira calls it, of our consciousness, different modulations. This is very significant when we're talking about cosmology, and it's why it's in my book on cosmology. Excuse me, because if we're talking about a physical cosmos and a physical Earth, then we're stuck in the paradigm of matter and atomism, as Stephen A. Young talks about in his book, A Fool's Wisdom. And he questions even the paradigm of atomism, because from the traditional perspective of physics, they will tell you that an atom, which is supposed to be a unit of matter, it's 99.99999% empty space. But there's this a little bit of physical stuff there still. And now we have people saying, well, what are the subatomic particles, allegedly, these protons and neutrons and electrons? And we hear about electron clouds. And I remember learning about the Rutherford experiment and J.J. Thomson and all this stuff. And now people are starting to question more and more, well, are those experiments are they being interpreted properly? Are the subatomic particles inferences where they perhaps are observing something energetic, and then they put a physical container on it? Where this goes among those who question atomism is that maybe there's nothing physical at all. Interestingly, that's where I landed when I was looking at consciousness, is that all reality is perhaps consciousness. As Erwin Schrödinger said, in truth, there is only one mind. Or as Max Planck, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard all matter as derivative from consciousness. And once we go there, this notion of questions of cosmology, it takes on a whole new shape. No pun intended, because we might not be dealing with something physical, and therefore the globe versus flat debate might be missing many other important nuances.
Could I just, bring one thing there? When we go down to idealism and the idea, which just goes way back to like Plato and pre-Platonic philosophers that were talking about this, but this idea that, okay, if material comes out of consciousness and we are consciousness, how are we to know that we aren't the only conscious, projector? right? This idea of solipsism, right? That's just like our own reality. And we know that because we see others are experiencing the same relation of consciousness. So it becomes quite apparent just using logic that we live in a consensus realm of consciousness. So where does that play into in terms of how the physical matter relates to us, especially moving into an age of mass information, where before we were in villages and small towns and the information was shared via very centralized conduits of control, whether it be your local newspaper or your official or your the priest class or through the Bible, etc. But now through the internet, we have immediate interconnection across the whole realm. How is that influencing the physical matter? If consciousness is consensus, and then in turn, how is that affecting how the nature and the shape and all of that is maybe morphing and changing? And then we've got all sorts of different effects around that. So you do touch on that towards the end, but I think those are exciting concepts to be navigating in this day and age. Do you think, Mark?
Yeah, it's super important, and it's counterintuitive. Because when we look, excuse me, at the world around us, we, again, interpret something physical and static, something that's not changing. But if all reality is actually just consciousness itself, that inherently implies that we live in a malleable place, which is a pretty trippy idea, that it's not static. And I want to take a few steps back, Mike, to elaborate a bit on what this idealist perspective entails.
Sure.
This is an ancient idea. When you look back at spiritual traditions all over the world, the idea of a unitary field of consciousness that we're all a part of, and they might use different language for it. But one of my favorite philosophers on this topic is named Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, and he's proposed what he calls analytic idealism. And the idea is that we live in what he calls a stream of consciousness as an analogy, and each of us is like a whirlpool within that stream. So we have the sense of being an individual, but we're fundamentally interconnected. And therefore, what happens to a whirlpool is affecting the full stream, and the stream is affecting the whirlpool together. The notion of solipsism, that's an important one to bring up, because people say, well, okay, are you just arguing that all that exists is my mind and that's it? And what Kastrup says is that we know consciousness for sure as an individual. It's actually the only thing that we can validate with confidence. Everything else is some form of inference, where right now at this moment, each of us feels like we're conscious. But then the next step, as you were saying, Mike, is that we look around the world and other people seem to be behaving in the same way that we are. So we can make what Kastrup calls a reasonable inference. It is an inference still, that not everyone else is a zombie that's just faking it. That because we know consciousness ourselves, Kastrup calls it an ontological category of consciousness. We know what that is because we experience it directly. We see others, and we know that we behave and feel a certain way. We can infer reasonably that they are that way too. So it's not solipsism per se. It's that we are these whirlpools within a singular stream. We could say that it's solipsism at the level of the full stream of consciousness, or at the level of God, it's solipsism. But as Kastrup says, it's like the one consciousness is having dissociative identity disorder, that there are these individuations of the oneness. So you end up in all kinds of paradoxes. And that's what Kastrup calls it the most parsimonious way of looking at reality, because the minute that you invoke a material world that exists outside of consciousness, and that's the mainstream cosmology, by the way. Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. Consciousness emerged later after billions of years of evolution through a human brain or through an animal brain, whatever. But there was a period in which there was a universe that existed and went on merrily without any consciousness. And that's the presumption of the materialist or physicalist view, that if all conscious entities, if all humans and animals died, for example, the universe would still exist. The problem with that philosophically is that we can't verify that. We could never validate something independent and outside of consciousness. And because of that, we end up with this separate ontological category of a universe, a physical universe, independent from and outside of consciousness, that we could never actually verify or experience. It's by definition unexperienceable. So the argument that Kastrup makes is that it's not as parsimonious to invoke this universe outside consciousness, because you have to invoke all kinds of additional assumptions that you could never verify. Whereas if you just start with consciousness, an ontological category that we know, we can validate, we can experience it, we can explain all of reality with that. Okay, so that's my preface. So let's just say Kastrup is directionally right, that it's more parsimonious to say that all is consciousness and we're individuations of it. Mike, you're absolutely right. Everything we look at in the world, we've got to consider differently. We've got to consider things like the Mandela effect, which I mentioned at the end of the book. Like, I don't know, the Mandela effect, for members of your audience that aren't familiar with it, is that things that we basically thought were true about something in the past now are a different truth. So like the line from Star Wars, Luke, I am your father. Many of us believe that's the line. That's not the line. The line is, no, I am your father. So the question is, are we all collectively misremembering, or did reality shift like a glitch in the matrix? And if so, that opens a can of worms.
And I think that can be explained well with the work of Walter Russell. And I think Walter Russell has done the best job that I know of as far as just explaining the whole creative mechanism and consciousness, as he explains. Sorry. Consciousness, as he explains, is produces electricity. Electricity produces resonance. Resonance creates form. And now, since we're all endowed with individualized consciousness, with the ability to have an idea, which creates that electrical event again in the resonance, and that resonance will create the form of our idea. Unless somebody, along the way indoctrinates us into, well, no, that's not the way it works. And, you have to agree with the collective. So, um, you can't find consciousness in form if consciousness creates form. And that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in, where they're trying to pick out physical matter into its minutial parts in order to find where that spark of life is in the first place, or if that indeed, or if there is a spark of life and that form just somehow spontaneously is created with a big bang. So, yeah, and that goes also into the old school thinking, with that electrical event being the first tier of the etheric mechanism, which they used to equate symbolically with the fire element, which we now know is paired up with hydrogen, and we could go deep into that. But the information is there, and also the fact that everything is waveforms, which gives the appearance. And also the whole foundation for theories like atomic theory and so forth.
Mm. This is so counterintuitive to the way that our biology interprets the world around us, because we are conditioned to interpret things like sequence even. We interpret the past to the present to the future because we have a memory, and we infer that the memory is accurate, even though the memory is just something that is occurring in the present moment. And then we create a whole narrative around it. And then we say that there's a world around us that's static, and it must have been that way before because we see it that way now. So I do think a lot of these more ancient concepts that you're referring to, Bear, like, and Stephen Young talks about this in his book, A Fool's Wisdom, going back to the elements, fire, air, earth, water, ether. That's not really in the current cosmology when you talk to mainstream physicists, but maybe those basic building blocks are where we need to go.
Yeah. Recently, I just did an advanced seminar in biogeometry. And in biogeometry, we recognize two polarities relative to consciousness. There's the sequential linear interpretation of events coming through our sensory apparatus, which you were kind of alluding to. And then there's that other level that is not entrained in a linear kind of format, but also open to all experience happening simultaneously. And in this last seminar, we were also introduced to new instruments where we can measure these linear timelines as we think of it, but then also deviate from those linear timelines to access data that goes into those other dimensions that open us to unlimited possibilities and get us off of that entrainment that A has to follow, or B has to follow A and so forth. So what's really cool about it is now you're not only conjecturing that maybe there's something besides a linear entrainment, but you're actually able to measure and also able to jump that timeline and actually change the experience, with this technology of what's happening in that linear timeline, which could go a long way to explain Mandela effect and so forth.
Mm. Fascinating. And to me, it's all plausible within the context of a consciousness focused universe. And I think what you're describing, Bear, also points to the importance of our mindset and how much our beliefs, both our conscious and subconscious beliefs, affecting our reality in ways that we don't see, because we often tend to have a Newtonian view of reality where it's like one billiard ball hits the next, where it's very linear, whereas reality might work in a much more mysterious way that's less tangible. And when we get into this realm, I understand why it can be abstract for people, because consciousness isn't something we can touch, or even our mindset. We can't point to it, but I can point you to a billiard ball. So it does take a lot of, I think, dedication and devotion for a person to say, I want to go down this road, because there is a bit of a leap of faith if you can't necessarily see the consequences at first. But then I think probably many members of your audience have seen this too. Once you have the consciousness shifts, you see it in your own life. And maybe you can't explain it in a peer-reviewed paper to people, but you know that the shifts have happened as a consequence in some way of your own mindset shift.
Yeah, the ironic thing is that if you just look to the simplest people in the realm, the natives, the indigenous folks, they all understand this, right? Like they understand everything's alive. So as you mentioned, our good friend Steve Young, Fool's Wisdom, fantastic book. You quote him a bunch in this new book, and Steve's doing great work and he's literally like a PhD in nuclear physics, and he came to understanding as an alchemist that everything's alive. When you understand that everything comes out of these elements, this is literally like this idea of animism, which really dominates a lot of classical indigenous cultures, is that everything's alive versus everything being these dead particles that are just being controlled by these specific laws. And when you can come to this simple understanding, then life just becomes much more magical and alive and flexible and loving and just so much like more fun, right? So yeah, you're so dead on, Mark. And I would say one of the biggest institutions besides the education slave system is in scientism, and I guess actually institutions of authority that we've looked at, and you do a whole chapter on this. And I was literally reading a post this morning about the moon landing on Substack that was really good, but is NASA. And it's insane to think that NASA still has like a $27 billion budget, I think, annually, and they haven't gone back to the moon, haven't put a man back to the moon in 60 years or whatever it is. It is clear to anybody in our circles that are looking into this that it is a propaganda arm of heliocentrism. And it's like Hollywood 2.0. I mean, all this money is going into the special effects. Steve Falconer's done some great breakdowns of this. But yeah, your chapter on NASA is spot on. You really hit all the points. Anything you'd like to just highlight there real quick? Because I think a lot of people that are still doubting all this go, what about this? What about we're sending, we got Elon Musk sending up rockets into space. We've got obviously all the footage of being on the moon. Well, we can easily debunk all that. But anything you'd like to mention there?
I would say that this was a hurdle for me when I got into this, because the first reaction to questioning mainstream cosmology is, well, then you mean that NASA's lying? How could it be that all these space agencies around the world are lying? And I actually don't cover this until chapter 6 of the book, because I try to break down some of the globe assumptions and the physics of it. But I'll give one example that to me is just kind of a slam dunk. The Apollo missions. NASA has admitted, I'm going to find the exact quote for you. Quote, aside from a few canisters of Apollo 9 telemetry tapes still stored at the Washington National Records Center, the Apollo era telemetry tapes no longer exist anywhere. This refers to the data that the missions were sending.
Well, it's
Yeah,
just
and
a
all the
simple
footage too.
misplacement. I can buy that. And we forget how to get back. Just a little anecdote. I had some interesting clients in my practice days, and I used to take care of a family that was one of the gentlemen that did one small step for mankind there. And there's some very interesting anomalies that are happening with those individuals. And I got to see this firsthand. And that there's seems to be an absence of memory about key events that, let's just say, if I was up there and set foot on a foreign planet or something, I think I'd remember it. But there seems to be this this interesting phenomena. And, back when I was treating these individuals, I didn't have as much of the information I have now. And I just chalked it up to, well, that's strange, what's going on. And interestingly, also, it led to a whole sequence of physiological events and symptoms with that, which is why they found their way to my doorstep in the first place. So, yeah, there's something going on there. I don't know what, but
I mean,
strange,
the
definitely.
astronauts when they got back and were at the the conference there when they're right. You talk about this in your book, Mark. They were like under a spell. They seemed despaired. They weren't. You think if you had just gotten back as the national hero for JFK's mission to the moon, right? To defeat Russia and everything in the Cold War. You are like a national hero. I would be so stoked. I would have supermodels around me and driving Lambo and like taking everyone out to dinner. Instead, they're forlorn and seem like they're under a spell. And I think to me, it's just very obvious they were MK Ultra. But what do you think, Mark?
Well, I asked that question too, Mike, because in my previous books, I looked a lot at MK Ultra and this notion that a person could be mind controlled such that he or she actually doesn't even remember things or doesn't even remember that he or she has a sub personality that has skills that the main person doesn't have. So there are technologies, effectively, ways of altering the mind whereby you can have true dissociation, where things that happened you have no access to, or maybe you do, but you need a lot of help from someone else. And so that was my first thought with these missions, because you only have a few people have ever been there. And on each mission, it's just a small number of men, and they've come back and they end up in a bunker afterwards. I quote a woman, she's a space psychologist named Ia Whiteley, and she talks about how many of the astronauts have problems with alcoholism and all sorts of issues. But what she didn't consider was what you're talking about, Mike and Bear, is that maybe something was going on in terms of mind control. And I'm saying this theoretically because I don't know for sure, but we have to consider it. And another reason a light bulb went off for me is that when I produced my podcast series in 2019 called Where Is My Mind? It's just eight episodes. We did one series, and it's all about the idea that consciousness doesn't come from the brain. One of the episodes was on psychic spying and the US government's program. And I interviewed Russell Targ, who was one of the laser physicists that ran the program in the 70s. And he said to me, look, like was over $20 million of funding, and it came from all the agencies. And NASA was one of the ones he listed. I remember thinking, that's kind of interesting. NASA's doing psychic spying? What they're interested in the mind. So when I was researching this and looking at Ia Whiteley's work on space psychology, I'm thinking, oh, wait, NASA was interested in the mind. They were investing in this back in the day. It would make sense that they would have access to this mind control technology. So it's at least theoretically possible, given the relatively number of small people that have been up very high in government organizations, that you could induce things in their mind, not to mention more conventional methods like blackmail and bribery and threats.
And
Yeah.
also ample documentation of people doing extraordinary things that go beyond the normal, what we think limits of senses, and actually proving that our senses are actually very elastic. A friend of ours who did the documentary Terrain for Andy Kaufman, Marcy, she was just here a couple weeks ago doing some filming for a new documentary. And she just got back from Mexico interviewing some people over there. And I won't mention names, but this one woman who has trained her children to read blindfolded. So she's got that coming up in her new
I've seen that
documentary.
in person.
Yeah.
I saw that happen in person, and not only reading but catching stuff like we were throwing stuff to them and they were catching and
Yeah.
playing video games blindfolded. Yeah.
And in martial arts, there's training that allows you to go beyond your normal what we think of as our limits as well, to see things before they happen and just open up more of that peripheral vision and so forth. So anyway, that's just a small example. There's tons of them out there, and I think a lot of us these days, as we question things, then the veils get thin in our own experience as well. And certain anomalies, glitches in the matrix, whatever you want to call them, become commonplace. And, my wife and myself, we've just learned to take them in stride. We just go, oh, yeah, we just know that there's more to things than meets the eye.
Yeah, and one of the challenges I've had, and I've come across this with other people, is the amount of deception implied by all of this. because we can't, I don't think it's possible to say that all of this is just ignorant mistakes. There are too many anomalies that everyone's aware of, where there is some intentionality among some people or spirits or who knows what, because I think it is multidimensional. But how is it that we live in a place where our very nature of what a human being is, what a consciousness is, where we are, that we're being deceived intentionally, and what's the true history behind that? I don't have an answer for it, but in some ways it's disturbing. And then feel very liberated in a way that I can't explain. Maybe there was a part of me that's always known things were not right, and I'm starting to uncover that and release and shed those layers. But there's something very liberating to say, okay, the falsehoods have been actually imposed, and we do live in whatever we are in, where there does seem to be dark and light, but the light is extremely strong once we get past the deception.
Dude,
And that's it.
I was listening to Witsit and Owen Benjamin stream last night, and Austin was saying this isn't crazy. So he was saying he knew of a military guy on Antarctica who had signed a non-disclosure, so couldn't say anything until he was 100 years old or something, but was basically saying there are cities on Antarctica that have millions of people in them. Millions. And so when we start to wrap our head around this idea, right, and really what Antarctica is and beyond it, it could start to make sense that we are in literally like a stasis chamber, like we're in a controlled environment here. And they set up the parameters for what we're allowed to know. And maybe there's lots of theories. Like, I mean, Jason Brashears talks about this being like a controlled, simulation, a simulacrum for us to develop our consciousness to move out eventually, or it was like an experiment. You have the Gnostic idea of the demiurge who did this. But that being said, just coming from a more conventional time right now and thinking that, whoa, are there cities with 1 million people in there? And maybe this guy was totally full of shit. But I think maybe that is a really important piece of the pie, is figuring out what the hell is going on Antarctica. And is that where the control system is? Is that where, or the control center is for running this aspect of the realm? And why in the heck are we not allowed to go there?
Well, all we have to do is look at flight and shipping routes and timeline anomalies and so forth. And there's a lot to explain there that might even give credence to what Mike's saying, that maybe there's something going on somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I want to add on to that. There are two things I talk about in the book, magnetic declination and time zones. I think it's worth talking about this for a few minutes because it was a big shift for me. Magnetic declination. This refers basically to the difference between the magnetic poles and the geographic poles on the sphere, because that's what the sphere model says, that there's a geographic place you can go to, that's the North Pole and the South Pole, but the magnetic North and South Poles are in different places. And by the way, they're moving around. Why are they moving around? Because the magnetic field of Earth, this is a pretty big deal. The magnetic field of Earth, this is what we use to navigate with compasses, is generated by the core of Earth. And we talked earlier about how the fact that we haven't been down there. We haven't been down 4,000 miles. We've only been down less than 8 miles. So it's just a theoretical construct. And yet this theoretical construct in the outer part of the core, because the inner core is allegedly too hot to generate a magnetic field, it exceeds what's known as the Curie point. But the outer core that we've never been to either allegedly generates the Earth's magnetic field because of the geodynamo effect, something to do with the spinning of the outer core and the tilt of Earth. But the geodynamo effect has never been demonstrated. And I quote in my book, The University of Maryland, where they say, look, like, we're going to try to demonstrate this, paraphrasing, but we're not sure if we can do it because no one ever has. So it's totally theoretical. What do we end up with? We end up with navigation on Earth where you have to manually adjust your compass to get to the right place on the spherical map. So there's automatically a big issue. But then if you go to, and I first learned this listening to Austin Witsit, he's got a multi-hour thing on his Schooling Gober's YouTube channel, magnetic-declination.com. Anyone can go to it. And you can click on different places of the map and see what the adjustment would be that's needed in order to get to the right place. And when you go down to Antarctica, getting to your point, Mike, some of the readings are like negative 178 degrees, meaning that whatever your compass says, turn around the other direction. And that's going to get you to the right place. And then you go a few miles away and the declination might be like 58 degrees in the positive. So it goes completely haywire, especially below the 60th south latitude. Very interesting. And Austin Witsit, in his presentation, he quotes a book from around 1900 where people talked about some of the the navigation problems in the way down in the south. Interestingly, if you were to take a general flat map and wrap it around a sphere, you'd have the biggest discrepancies in the south. You'd have some in the north, but the south would go completely haywire because you're taking a circle, and the quote unquote south in the circle is near the perimeter, near the circumference. You've got to take all of that and squish it into the bottom of the globe. So it would make sense that if something were being hidden in Antarctica, you would do that through this a false sense of where the magnetic field comes from, and then not allowing people to go that far south. Yet near the equator, which is where the flat and the spherical maps are closest to alignment, you have the least amount of magnetic declination. And it's the same thing with time zones, by the way, where you would expect, why not just do 24 time zones, 24 hours in a day, one time zone per hour, basically. And at the equator, we do have 24 time zones where the flat and the spherical maps are closest. And yet in the northern hemisphere, we have 19 time zones. In the southern hemisphere, there are 32. And you've got time zones hidden in the ocean. Very strange things, which some people would say, well, that's just, politics. Another explanation is, well, things are being hidden, especially what's going on in the south, because it's really important.
Yeah, and you have like old stories of sailors. What is his name? Who supposedly followed along Antarctica and was in, I don't know how many nautical miles, but it was very similar to the length of, is it Captain Cook? Is that who it was?
It might have been.
Yeah, Captain Cook, who went down to Antarctica, and this was in the 1800s, and just stayed along the shoreline there. And it was way, way more nautical miles than the conventional mileage is right now for this quote unquote continent. And yeah, it's interesting too that I've tried to watch some YouTubes of like modern seafarers going down there, and Cook talks about this too, is that, and this might have to do with some sort of magnetic anomaly or something that might relate to this beyond just the shape, but it seems like the storms get really, really crazy. We're talking like 30, 40-foot waves. It's actually very difficult technically to even get down there. So yeah, I think this is like where, people talk about airships, and, airships would actually have allowed us to get there, because they can basically go long, long distances without the need for refueling like a traditional airplane, and can be more stable. And of course they took out airships with Hindenburg. And so, yeah, I think this is the wild frontier of where we'll be going in the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and I just want to add that this topic of time zones in particular, a lot of the analysis that I was looking at was from Hervé Riboni, who was a professional sailor, and he was a participant in the 1993-1994 Whitbread Round the World race. And he's talking about how time zones are being hidden. So this is a sailor who's been all over. That to me was very powerful. As someone new to this, I couldn't, sailors talking about a non-spherical Earth, and pilots are doing this too. I actually met a pilot a few months ago randomly when I was traveling abroad who sat next to me, and I didn't know I was going to write a book. And he said, yep, I've been flying for years. And I used to teach people, it's definitely not a spinning globe.
I got my pilot's license years back, and during my training, we had to fly without instruments. It was called horizon flying, where they covered up the instruments, so you just had to go by way of the horizon. And we were pretty far up there, and we used to do this quite often. And so you're constantly focused on the horizon from a great altitude, and there's really no discernible curvature no matter how high you get up. Now, I don't know if that's just my perception, but it sure seemed like a linear horizon no matter what. So I don't know. I hear a lot of other pilots sharing that experience, people that actually have more professional experience than I did.
Well, you raise an interesting point, Bear, because I do hear some people say, well, I was on an airplane and I saw curvature. So I think the term curvature needs to be specified.
Mm-hmm.
Curvature in a circular sense is different than curvature in a spherical sense.
Mm-hmm.
So what you were just describing is not being able to see down and away curvature, because
Mm-hmm.
theoretically you're always at the top of a ball. So it should be curving down and away at a very specific rate, by the way, because we are told what the radius value is. So that's really what people should be looking at if they want to question this. Look at how high you are. What's the calculation of what the curvature should be? and see if that actually matches it. Versus we often hear just, we see a picture and we see some curvature, and sometimes it's down and away due to a fisheye lens or something. And people say, oh, look, it's spherical. But really, we need to be specific about this. At the altitude of the ISS or wherever it is, or on an airplane, how much downward and away curvature should you be seeing? And do you see that? Versus the circular part. And the circular part is important too, because it relates to the way that we see. There's something known as an azimuthal grid of vision, and it basically deals with visual perspective. The idea is, in a very basic sense, if you're looking at lights on a street and they're all the same height, you're looking down a straight street, the lights will look like they're going down toward your eye level, even though they're all the same height. And if we apply this to the observations of the things in the celestial realms, think about it for a second. That means that everything you're looking at a distance will look like it's actually going down to your eye level. You end up with what appears to be a personalized dome of vision. So it does look a bit circular in that sense, but it's circular, not a down and away. And that has to do with the way that we perceive distant objects. And I actually quoted in my book, a book on perspective, because artists know this. When they draw, they have to account for this, and architects know this. But most astronomers usually don't account for it.
And perception is programming. Walter Russell in his books gives an example of, you're down here for the first time observing just reality on this plane as we think of it. And let's just say you're looking at a train at a great distance coming at you, and it's very small. And then all of a sudden it's upon you, and it's like this giant, tremendous thing. And it's all perception. Of course, if you are not taught about what's happening at a distance and close range, it would be hard to know what to make of it. So, yeah, we're programmed to interpret things the way we've been programmed.
Our biology does it, and then we have to reverse engineer. I mean, another example that anyone can understand is if you're on railroad tracks. These are parallel tracks.
Right.
They will look to you like they're converging in a diagonal up to a vanishing point, up to your eye level if you're just right now down near the railroad tracks. But we know they're parallel. So the way Austin Whitsitt has put it, I think he puts it very well, is that the way that we perceive is non-Euclidean. We actually have curved visual space. Mm-hmm. So it introduces a perception of curvature that's not actually there. So we have to rethink all of our observations, which, a lot of knee-jerk reactions to this stuff is, well, I saw this thing and it looks like it's spherical, therefore it is. And there's a deeper level here of uncovering that's not done.
Well, and back to the navigation, for countless hundreds and thousands of years, really, if you get into deeper ideas around who was circumnavigating or whatever you want to call it, but going to other lands, they were using the stars, right? And the idea that the stars are fixed, all the luminaries are fixed, and it gives you a map. And now, of course, we use modern times, different with the sextant, and they use the sextant too with the stars. But now, if you're using modern navigation techniques, especially in the South, you have to actually use certain charts, right, for corrections based upon the anomalies of the magnetics that they express. Could you explain that briefly? Because that's another just form of like, how are we regressing? I feel like this whole system they're pushing on us is actually regressing us away from things that we just commonly knew from observation, like navigating by the stars.
Right. Yeah. And this relates to the magnetic declination issue, where we're told that the magnetic field comes from a certain thing. I was talking to a former pilot the other day, and the person was saying, yeah, I did always have to adjust my compass manually and use these magnetic declination charts to get to the right place. Why? And we just accept it as that's how it is. But maybe it's because all the fundamentals of what we think about what this place is, it's wrong. And you could explain things much more parsimoniously. For example, the common model in the flat plane framework is that there's a magnetic north, and everything east, west, south are just relative to that. And the magnetic north is the same as the geographic north. Whereas right now we have differences between the geographic and the magnetic poles. And then we have to make these crazy adjustments just to get to the right place.
Yeah, I don't see my compass pointing south ever.
One more example of perception, something that always stuck with me is when I was a freshman in college, I had a class, cultural anthropology, and it was talking about a village in South America when Magellan ships first arrived on the horizon. Nobody could see them, even though they were in plain sight from a particular village offshore. However, a shaman who was gazing at the horizon for quite some time as they were parked there was finally able to see them. Of course, he was trained to see what other people, were not observing simply because they were not taught that certain things exist. But he was able, with quite some effort over time, to convince the rest of the villagers that there was actually something out there, but a ship was so far out of the frame of their reality at that point, it really took some time before they could all observe it, and finally they did. So, again, that goes back to not just the fact that our senses are elastic, but also they're programmable.
Mm-hmm. And we have to then think, what are the things that we believe now just because we were programmed, especially from a young age, and taken as an assumption to be true? And it feels to me like it's basically everything at this point.
I know. I love what Steve talks about and Steve Young in his book about how we're like we're born into sci-fi novels and movies and this idea that like rockets are normal. They're just like normal aircraft to go penetrate into space. But when you break free from that conditioning, you realize they're just penises trying to penises trying to break through the firmament. And it becomes just so comical, right? It's just like this phallic representation of insanity. Um, yeah. Oh man, you can have a lot of fun with this, though, I'll say.
Yeah,
Um,
we're told to trust the authorities, and that if we see something on TV, it's real and it's serious, and these are major milestones. And then if you ask questions about it, you get called a conspiracy theorist. So that is always interesting to me too, especially as I get into more and more controversial waters. I learn about people. Um, let's say someone was able to hang with me for the first two books, and then the third book comes out on Liberty, and they're like, I can't take you seriously anymore. And each book there are people who are with me before who are no longer with me. And I get insights into human psychology where people are unwilling to challenge certain assumptions, and they can tend to get angry about it. And that's interesting to me too, because especially as it relates to cosmology, this stuff shouldn't be considered dangerous. These are just beliefs about where we live. I could at least somewhat understand, if you're talking about health, how someone could consider that dangerous. If they truly believe in the contagion model as it is, and they say you don't believe in it, then you could make someone sick. So based on their belief system, I understand how it could be dangerous. The cosmology stuff, I don't get. I don't get it.
well,
Beyond, go ahead.
I'll just say this: like your cosmology defines your reality. So it is
Yeah.
on the inverse. When people go, "Why does this matter? Why do we even care? Like, why do you guys spend time on this?" Well, literally, your cosmology defines how you relate to everything in your world and relate to yourself. So it does matter. But with your question, I think it's just heavy programming, and their systems are fraught and they don't know how to deal with it, so they go to anger. And I think it's touching on a sensitive, deep truth that they've been lying to themselves their whole life. And also many just have a lot at stake because their whole livelihood depends upon the lie. But yeah, we see that a lot. We see it even in our like Telegram group and stuff. When this subject comes up, some people frizz out and just get very angry. um yeah, it is quite fascinating to watch.
Yeah. And it was something I had to consider when I put the book out. What, am I ready to deal with that? I mean, I've dealt with it in the past, and the answer for me is always yes. That I just have to hold my foundation in a strong way and understand why I'm saying the things I'm saying, what my backing is, what the logic is, what the evidence is. And if someone else can't understand it, that shows me something about them, and it's not about me. And I'm harping on this because we're all dealing with this to some degree. We have to live in a world where people believe things that we probably think are not true. And it can be difficult to interact sometimes when you're literally living in a different reality than someone else.
Well, the good news is the present reality is only maintained by the consensus of folks that are believing that things are such, and that is rapidly reaching a point of critical momentum, we'll say, in the opposite direction. And when you're simply observing true patterns, we're not saying shapes or anything definitive, but just patterns, then it really aligns you with greater forces, and it makes it possible for a relative few within the collective to reach that critical mass point where the consciousness shifts altogether. And I think we're about at that point.
It really feels that way. And it feels like the COVID era helped with that. I mean,
Mhm.
I've come to look more and more as that things we might call tragic as great learning experiences or great growth experiences, so that pain and suffering paradoxically can lead to very good things. And certainly there was a lot of pain and suffering on many levels since 2020. But look at what it's done. I mean, I had written 2 books before the lockdown started, An End to Upside Down Thinking and End to Upside Down Living. I wasn't looking at conspiracies with government at the time. I wasn't close to it, but it wasn't really in my consciousness, let alone questioning germ theory or cosmology. But because of the amount of deception that I saw during COVID, look at what it's done in my own life. And I'm just one example. I know many other people are waking up too. And now we have Steve Young, a theoretical physics PhD, saying in his book of Fool's Wisdom that he knows with 100% confidence it's not a spinning globe, even though he's not sure exactly what it is. These are monumental things. I mean, he's a well-trained physicist. That's just one example. So I do think there is perhaps a critical mass, but it's due to the suffering that maybe came from the ignorance that that was imposed on us for so many years, and now we're just breaking out of it.
Yeah, let's just hope that we don't have to have more collateral damage before we have a mass awakening. And Steve is an amazing guy because he not only has the academic credentials, but he's also a very well-versed student in the alchemical sciences of old. And of course, that is more the qualitative polarity of the scientific methodology, not just looking at the quantification and the materialistic aspects, but also, the attributes that form that in the first place. So he's one of those rare individuals that's connected all the dots. And empirical observation does tend to align with those old alchemical aspects, I found.
Yeah, so it seems to me more and more, and let's say my old view of society was that we were evolving in an upward trajectory, that we were moving to, we're at the pinnacle of advancement and we're moving towards something more advanced. Where now I feel like it's the reverse, where the ancients knew things that we have devolved from, very basic principles. And so now if something is considered to be going back to the Stone Ages, I'm like, okay, well, what is it? Because I want to know what they used to believe.
I think it's
Yeah.
cyclic, and maybe in that fashion, those down periods, which we seem to be in one right now, are just those little stimulus that we need, like you're saying, with the suffering, in order to get to a new elevated cycle and so forth. But go ahead, Mike, you're about to say something.
I was just going to say, I do think it's a bit of a spiral. I do think in the general long frame of things, there's a progression. But within that mass progression, there are cycles of up and down. So it's kind of like, but still heading. I do believe there is a long progression here of consciousness in general. That consciousness is in its actual pure essence. It's driven to progress towards finer and finer and higher consciousness. This comes out of a great book, Thinking in Destiny by H.W. Percival, who lays out the reasoning behind that. But that being said, yeah, we are in definitely exciting times because we're relearning all of this stuff that we've forgotten. And I think even we see that in traditional conventional science, like they've had to agree just with quantum mechanics, the nature of the observer, right? And they're having to agree more and more that, well, they don't want to, but there are some physicists coming out that are more idealists, and like Penrose, I'm thinking of, and these others that are really saying that materialism isn't the basis of it, and that maybe this search for this God particle is kind of ridiculous. It's more about the wave than the particle. And yeah, so Mark, as we're coming to the end here, well, one, anything that you'd like to also discuss related to this book, and then two, where do you see the conventional sciences going? You see it all breaking down? Do you see them doubling down? Or do you see that there is a shift more towards what we're discussing here from where we're coming from today?
In some ways, I see a shift, and in other ways, I see a doubling down. And maybe that's just a bifurcation in society where some people are just going to simply go away from the structures and build their own new societies and have music and sky festivals and confluence and get people together and then just live it themselves. And the system is going to system. It's going to do its thing. It's designed to be that way. So that's what I'm feeling. And especially coming from a background where I know people from Princeton and the Wall Street world, and people that I would say in some ways are incredibly brilliant, and yet even with all the evidence that's come out in the last few years of deception, they'll still continue to deny that. it makes me think that there is just a wall in certain cases and everyone's on their own journey. But that wall is what I'm seeing is perhaps a microcosm of the fact that the system is going to be there for a while. And it's up to us as individuals on our own journeys to decide whether we want to opt in or opt out. That's where I see it going.
And some of the most well-established spiritual practices that have been around a long time, of course, they tell us that any identification with either side of the polarity, bifurcation, is an attachment. And we really don't have true knowledge until we lose those attachments. So maybe this bifurcation is purposeful, and you have folks, you have the hardcore flat earthers, you have the opposite on the other side. And, here our discussion is all based on, well, we don't know what shape the earth is. It seems to be, there seems to be some functionality behind it. It seems that it would be worthwhile to understand that, and maybe we'd understand more about ourselves at the same time. And like Mike and I are often saying, well, we really don't have a dog in any fight. We just want to know what's going on. And yeah, I don't think the truth is on either side. That's just my take. Because how do we know until we're not on either side?
Yeah, well, I quote in the book a guy from the secret space program, which gets
Mhm.
to, I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Contact, where I look
Mhm.
at contact with non-human intelligence. So that means the UFO phenomenon that's been reported throughout the ages, but also contact in a metaphysical sense. So in a
Mhm.
near-death experience, someone encounters a being of light, or in a psychedelic account. So there's all kinds of contact. But the secret space program is interesting because people who come back from that, first of all, they've all been mind controlled, heavy mind control,
Mhm.
which I think should raise some suspicions because we don't know what they've been programmed with, and they might not even know. But they're talking about going on other planets as physical things. So they're often talking about a spherical Earth, very conventional consensus cosmology. But there was one guy I quoted from the secret space program who's talking more like you guys are, which is like, look, it's way more complex than just flat or spherical because we're dealing with multidimensional stuff. And until I can actually go there independently with my friends, not with a group that's putting me up there, we're not going to know this stuff conclusively. So he hits on 2 points. One is the ability to independently verify, but also the multidimensional nature of reality. And I think he's alluding to the fact that nothing's really physical and that this is so much more complex than the simplicity of one shape or the other.
And that definitely opens up to explanations that aren't entertained on either side. So, Mark, this has been a wonderful conversation. And can you tell our audience where they can find you, where they can find your books and all your work, and anything else that you might have going on right now that we haven't already talked about?
Well, nothing else going on right now. This new book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, came out a few weeks ago. And whenever I finish a book, I always think I'm never going to write again unless something comes my way that's just that paradigm shifting that I get pulled to it. So I'm in that place of unknowing, which it's sometimes uncomfortable, but I'm getting used to it because I left my job several years ago. So nothing new coming up for me other than speaking about my books and especially the Cosmos book. But if your audience is interested, all of my books are on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I read the Audibles myself. Also, my website has more information on me and my books. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. And I should mention my podcast series from 2019, which a lot of people still listen to because the topic of consciousness versus the brain, that's something that we're still all thinking about for the most part, and whether we survive bodily death in some way and near-death experiences. It's called Where Is My Mind? It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major players, and it's just 8 episodes, so you can binge it in like 4.5 hours or something.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. And do you get to hang out with Dean Radin at all?
I do hang out with Dean Radin, only occasionally because I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He's been the chief scientist there for years, and he studies things like telepathic abilities, mind-matter interactions, and things that are
Yeah,
very relevant to consciousness.
psi phenomenon, which, maybe I'd love to have you back on to go deeper into that, UFOs as well, UAPs, and how that relates to different cosmologies and how, because typically that's sold into, as you're saying, with the one secret space guy that, it's typically more like conventional globe, vacuum space, but then there's these, higher intelligences that have figured out ways to either go faster than the speed of light or like bend space time, and all these things. But I like that in that book, which I'm about halfway through, you start, you get more into the other ideas too of what these, because clearly there's phenomenon going on. And clearly on the psi stuff, like there's telekinesis and this idea of being able to see the future. And I've had those experiences myself where I've seen a future event happening and it happens. So there's all sorts of interesting rabbit holes we can go down in relating to cosmology on that. And so I'd love to have you back on, maybe, 3, 4 months down the line, and to dive deeper into these topics, because you're really fun to talk to. You lay it all out very concisely. And I think you're a great conduit for people just coming into this, because your perspective and your demeanor is very neutral. And you don't get stuck into emotion. And so in doing that, you're providing a great service. So thanks, Mark.
Well, thank you
And
very much.
Thank you. And I look forward to another conversation. I think we're just scratching the surface here today, and it's been wonderful.
Thank you. Happy to talk anytime you guys want, and just really enjoy chatting with you.
Likewise.
MarkGober.com. Go support Mark. Get his books if you haven't yet. Are any of your books on are listenable? Are they on?
All on Audible, and I read them myself, which is a whole ordeal, but I think it's important for the author to read it.
Yeah, I heard you say that, and I'm going to download some of those. When I go into town, I have long drives, and it's a great opportunity, especially if I know it's in your voice. It'll be fun to listen to.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy them.
I do have an idea for your next book.
Oh, what is it?
The end to upside down law, and you could get into the true nature of I know, because that's another huge topic at Confluence and Music and Sky. We're always talking about how what people think is law and legal and all that, and that's also a really big rabbit hole that opens up a whole nother realm of reality when you understand how that's all been inverted. But
and I think next conversation we definitely need to dissect Horton Hears a Who.
Yes. I agree, man. We'll do more Dr. Seuss. Actually, somebody in the chat, by the way, when you mentioned that, Bear, had actually knew Dr. Seuss and helped plan his 80th birthday party.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Well, I won't go into that. His daughter was at large, and she used to show up wearing these, Dr. Seuss costumes and everything. So, anyway, big Dr. Seuss fan, and also a big fan of yours, Mark. Thank you once again.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of both of you guys too. Likewise.
Thanks, Mark. I'm off to go have some green eggs and ham, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Remember, everyone, remember to get outside, get your feet in the dirt, go plant something, go for a hike, show Mother Nature some love. You'll be illumined beyond degree. And we love you so much. Thanks for showing up. Give this a like and a thumbs up. It really helps us get the information out to more folks. And next week on Thursday, 10 a.m., we have the great James Tunney coming back. One of my favorite
that'd be
thinkers.
awesome. Yeah.
So see us next time, 10 a.m. We keep the fire going. Love you all. Have a great weekend. Peace.